Section 59 of Volume 1E of History of England from the Invasion of Julius Caesar to the Revolution of 1688. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Golding. History of England from the Invasion of Julius Caesar to the Revolution of 1688 by David Hume, Volume 1E, Section 59, Chapter 61, Part 6. During these transactions, great demonstrations of mutual friendship and regard passed between the French king and the Protector. Lord Fauconberg, Cromwell's son-in-law, was dispatched to Louis, then in the camp before Dunkirk, and was received with the regard usually paid to foreign princes by the French court. Mazarin sent to London his nephew Mancini, along with the Duke of Crequi, and expressed his regret that his urgent affairs should deprive him of the honour which he had long wished for, of paying in person his respects to the greatest man in the world. The Protector reaped little satisfaction from the success of his arms abroad. The situation in which he stood at home kept him in perpetual uneasiness and inquietude. His administration, so expensive both by military enterprises and secret intelligence, had exhausted his revenue, and involved him in a considerable debt. The royalists, he heard, had renewed their conspiracies for a general insurrection, and Ormond was secretly come over with a view of concerting measures for the execution of this project. Lord Fairfax, Sir William Waller, and many heads of the Presbyterians had secretly entered into the engagement. Even the army was infected with the general spirit of discontent, and some sudden and dangerous eruption was every moment to be dreaded from it. No hopes remained, after his violent breach with the last Parliament, that he should ever be able to establish, with general consent, a legal settlement, or temper the military with any mixture of civil authority. All his arts and policy were exhausted, and having so often, by fraud and false pretences, deceived every party, and almost every individual, he could no longer hope, by repeating the same professions, to meet with equal confidence and regard. However zealous the royalists, their conspiracy took not effect. Willis discovered the whole to the Protector. Ormond was obliged to flee, and he deemed himself fortunate to have escaped so vigilant an administration. Great numbers were thrown into prison. A high court of justice was anew erected for the trial of those criminals whose guilt was most apparent. Notwithstanding the recognition of his authority by the last Parliament, the Protector could not as yet trust to an unbiased jury. Sir Henry Slingsby and Dr. Huet were condemned and beheaded. Mordaunt, brother to the Earl of Peterborough, narrowly escaped. The numbers for his condemnation and his acquittal were equal, and just as the sentence was pronounced in his favour, Colonel Pride, who was resolved to condemn him, came into court. Ashton, Story, and Bestley were hanged in different streets of the city. The conspiracy of the millenarians in the army struck Cromwell with still greater apprehensions. Harrison and the other discarded officers of that party could not remain at rest. Stimulated equally by revenge, by ambition, and by conscience, they still harboured in their breasts some desperate project, and there wanted not officers in the army, who, from like motives, were disposed to second all their undertakings. The levellers and agitators had been encouraged by Cromwell to impose with their advice in all political deliberations, and he had even pretended to honour many of them with his intimate friendship, while he conducted his daring enterprises against the king and the Parliament. It was a usual practice with him, in order to familiarize himself the more with the agitators, who were commonly corporals or sergeants, to take them to bed with him, and there, after prayers and exhortations, to discuss together their projects and principles, political as well as religious. Having assumed the dignity of Protector, he excluded them from all his councils, and had neither leisure nor inclination to indulge them any further in their wonted familiarities. Among those who were enraged at this treatment was Sexby, an active agitator, who now employed against him all that restless industry which had formerly been exerted in his favour. He even went so far as to enter into a correspondence with Spain, and Cromwell, who knew the distempers of the army, was justly afraid of some mutiny, to which a day, an hour, an instant might provide leaders. Of assassinations likewise he was apprehensive, from the zealous spirit which actuated the soldiers. Sindercombe had undertaken to murder him, and by the most unaccountable accidents had often been prevented from executing his bloody purpose. His design was discovered, but the Protector could never find the bottom of the enterprise, nor detect any of his accomplices. He was tried by a jury, and notwithstanding the general odium attending that crime, notwithstanding the clear and full proof of his guilt, so little conviction prevailed of the Protector's right to the supreme government, it was with the utmost difficulty that this conspirator was condemned. When every thing was prepared for his execution, he was found dead, from poison, as is supposed, which he had voluntarily taken. The Protector might better have supported these fears and apprehensions which the public distempers occasioned, had he enjoyed any domestic satisfaction, or possessed any cordial friend of his own family, in whose bosom he could safely have unloaded his anxious and corroding cares. But Fleetwood, his son-in-law, actuated by the wildest zeal, began to estrange himself from him, and was enraged to discover that Cromwell, in all his enterprises, had entertained views of promoting his own grandeur, more than of encouraging piety and religion, of which he made such fervent professions. His eldest daughter, married to Fleetwood, had adopted republican principles so vehement that she could not with patience behold power lodged in a single person, even in her indulgent father. His other daughters were no less prejudiced in favour of the royal cause, and regretted the violences and iniquities into which they thought their family had so unhappily been transported. Above all, the sickness of Mrs. Claypole, his peculiar favourite, a lady endued with many humane virtues and amiable accomplishments, depressed his anxious mind, and poisoned all his enjoyments. She had entertained a high regard for Dr. Hewitt, lately executed, and being refused his pardon, the melancholy of her temper, increased by her distempered body, had prompted her to lament to her father all his sanguinary measures, and urge him to compunction for those heinous crimes into which his fatal ambition had betrayed him. Her death, which followed soon after, gave new edge to every word which she had uttered. All composure of mind was now for ever fled from the Protector. He felt that the grandeur which he had attained with so much guilt and courage could not insure him that tranquillity which it belongs to virtue alone, and moderation fully to ascertain. Overwhelmed with the load of public affairs, dreading perpetually some fatal accident in his distempered government, seeing nothing around him but treacherous friends or enraged enemies, possessing the confidence of no party, resting his title on no principle, civil or religious, he found his power to depend on so delicate a poise of factions and interests, as the smallest event was able, without any preparation, in a moment to overturn. Death, too, which with such signal intrepidity he had braved in the field, being incessantly threatened by the poniards of fanatical or interested assassins, was ever present to his terrified apprehension, and haunted him in every scene of business or repose. Each action of his life betrayed the terrors under which he laboured. The aspect of strangers was uneasy to him. With a piercing and anxious eye, he surveyed every face to which he was not daily accustomed. He never moved a step without strong guards attending him. He wore armour under his clothes, and further secured himself by offensive weapons, a sword, falchion, and pistols, which he always carried about him. He returned from no place by the direct road, or by the same way which he went. Every journey he performed with hurry and precipitation. Seldom he slept above 3 nights together in the same chamber, and he never let it be known beforehand what chamber he intended to choose, nor entrusted himself in any which was not provided with back doors, at which sentinels were carefully placed. Society terrified him, while he reflected on his numerous unknown and implacable enemies. Solitude astonished him, by withdrawing that protection which he found so necessary for his security. His body, also from the contagion of his anxious mind, began to be affected, and his health seemed sensibly to decline. He was seized with a slow fever, which changed to a tertian ague. For the space of a week no dangerous symptoms appeared, and in the intervals of the fits he was able to walk abroad. At length the fever increased, and he himself began to entertain some thoughts of death, and to cast his eye towards that future existence whose idea had once been intimately present to him, though since, in the hurry of affairs and the shock of wars and factions, it had, no doubt, been considerably obliterated. He asked Goodwin, one of his preachers, if the doctrine were true, that the elect could never fall or suffer a final reprobation. "Nothing more certain," replied the preacher. "Then I am safe," said the Protector, "for I am sure that once I was in a state of grace." His physicians were sensible of the perilous condition to which his distemper had reduced him; but his chaplains, by their prayers, visions, and revelations, so buoyed up his hopes, that he began to believe his life out of all danger. A favourable answer, it was pretended, had been returned by heaven to the petitions of all the godly, and he relied on their asseverations much more than on the opinion of the most experienced physicians. "I tell you," he cried with confidence to the latter, "I tell you, I shall not die of this distemper. I am well assured of my recovery. It is promised by the Lord, not only to my supplications, but to those of men who hold a stricter commerce and more intimate correspondence with him. Ye may have skill in your profession, but nature can do more than all the physicians in the world, and God is far above nature." Nay, to such a degree of madness did their enthusiastic assurances mount, that upon a fast day, which was observed on his account both at Hampton Court and at Whitehall, they did not so much pray for his health, as give thanks for the undoubted pledges which they had received of his recovery. He himself was overheard offering up his addresses to heaven, and so far had the illusions of fanaticism prevailed over the plainest dictates of natural morality, that he assumed more the character of a mediator, in interceding for his people, than of a criminal whose atrocious violation of social duty had, from every tribunal, human and divine, merited the severest vengeance. Meanwhile, all the symptoms began to wear a more fatal aspect, and the physicians were obliged to break silence, and to declare that the Protector could not survive the next fit with which he was threatened. The council was alarmed. A deputation was sent to know his will with regard to his successor. His senses were gone, and he could not now express his intentions. They asked him whether he did not mean that his eldest son Richard should succeed him in the protectorship. A simple affirmative was, or seemed to be, extorted from him. Soon after, on the 3rd of September, that very day which he had always considered as the most fortunate for him, he expired. A violent tempest, which immediately succeeded his death, served as a subject of discourse to the vulgar. His partisans, as well as his enemies, were fond of remarking this event, and each of them endeavored, by forced inferences, to interpret it as a confirmation of their particular prejudices. The writers attached to the memory of this wonderful person make his character, with regard to abilities, bear the air of the most extravagant panegyric. His enemies form such a representation of his moral qualities as resembles the most virulent invective. Both of them, it must be confessed, are supported by such striking circumstances in his conduct and fortune, as bestow on their representation a great air of probability. What can be more extraordinary, it is said, than that a person of private birth and education, no fortune, no eminent qualities of body, which have sometimes, nor shining talents of mind, which have often, raised men to the highest dignities, should have the courage to attempt, and the abilities to execute, so great a design as the subverting one of the most ancient and best established monarchies in the world; that he should have the power and boldness to put his prince and master to an open and infamous death; should banish that numerous and strongly allied family; cover all these temerities under a seeming obedience to a parliament, in whose service he pretended to be retained; trample too upon that parliament in their turn, and scornfully expel them as soon as they gave him ground of dissatisfaction; erect in their place the dominion of the saints, and give reality to the most visionary idea which the heated imagination of any fanatic was ever able to entertain; suppress again that monster in its infancy, and openly set himself above all things that ever were called sovereign in England; overcome first all his enemies by arms, and all his friends afterwards by artifice; serve all parties patiently for a while, and command them victoriously at last; overrun each corner of the three nations, and subdue, with equal facility, both the riches of the south and the poverty of the north; be feared and courted by all foreign princes, and be adopted a brother to the gods of the earth; call together parliaments with a word of his pen, and scatter them again with the breath of his mouth; reduce to subjection a warlike and discontented nation, by means of a mutinous army; command a mutinous army by means of seditious and factious officers; be humbly and daily petitioned that he would be pleased, at the rate of millions a year, to be hired as master of those who had hired him before to be their servant; have the estates and lives of 3 nations as much at his disposal as was once the little inheritance of his father, and be as noble and liberal in the spending of them. And lastly, for there is no end of enumerating every particular of his glory, with one word bequeath all this power and splendor to his posterity. He possessed of peace at home and triumph abroad, be buried among kings, and with more than regal solemnity, and leave a name behind him not to be extinguished but with the whole world, which, as it was too little for his praise, so might it have been for his conquests, if the short line of his mortal life could have stretched out to the extent of his immortal designs. My intention is not to disfigure this picture, drawn by so masterly a hand. I shall only endeavour to remove from it somewhat of the marvellous, a circumstance which, on all occasions, gives much ground for doubt and suspicion. It seems to me that the circumstance of Cromwell's life in which his abilities are principally discovered is his rising from a private station, in opposition to so many rivals, so much talented before him, to a high command and authority in the army. His great courage, his signal military talents, his eminent dexterity and address were all requisite for this important acquisition. Yet will not this promotion appear the effect of supernatural abilities, when we consider that Fairfax himself, a private gentleman, who had not the advantage of a seat in Parliament, had, through the same steps, attained even a superior rank, and, if endued with common capacity and penetration, had been able to retain it. To incite such an army to rebellion against the Parliament required no uncommon art or industry. To have kept them in obedience had been the more difficult enterprise. When the breach was once formed between the military and civil parties, a supreme and absolute authority, from that moment, is devolved on the general; and if he be afterwards pleased to employ artifice or policy, it may be regarded, on most occasions, as great condescension, if not as superfluous caution. That Cromwell was ever able really to blind or overreach either the king or the republicans does not appear. As they possessed no means of resisting the force under his command, they were glad to temporize with him, and, by seeming to be deceived, wait for opportunities of freeing themselves from his dominion. If he seduced the military fanatics, it is to be considered that their interest and his evidently concurred, that their ignorance and low education exposed them to the grossest imposition, and that he himself was at bottom as frantic an enthusiast as the worst of them, and in order to obtain their confidence needed but to display those vulgar and ridiculous habits which he had early acquired, and on which he set so high a value. An army is so forcible and at the same time so coarse a weapon, that any hand which wields it may, without much dexterity, perform any operation and attain any ascendant in human society. The domestic administration of Cromwell, though it discovers great abilities, was conducted without any plan either of liberty or arbitrary power. Perhaps his difficult situation admitted of neither. His foreign enterprises, though full of intrepidity, were pernicious to national interest, and seem more the result of impetuous fury or narrow prejudices than of cool foresight and deliberation. An eminent personage, however, he was in many respects, and even a superior genius, but unequal and irregular in his operations. And though not defective in any talent except that of elocution, the abilities which in him were most admirable, and which most contributed to his marvellous success, were the magnanimous resolution of his enterprises, and his peculiar dexterity in discovering the characters and practising on the weaknesses of mankind. If we survey the moral character of Cromwell with that indulgence which is due to the blindness and infirmities of the human species, we shall not be inclined to load his memory with such violent reproaches as those which his enemies usually throw upon it. Amidst the passions and prejudices of that period, that he should prefer the parliamentary to the royal cause will not appear extraordinary, since, even at present, some men of sense and knowledge are disposed to think that the question, with regard to the justice of the quarrel, may be regarded as doubtful and uncertain. The murder of the king, the most atrocious of all his actions, was to him covered under a mighty cloud of republican and fanatical illusions, and it is not impossible but that he might believe it, as many others did, the most meritorious action that he could perform. His subsequent usurpation was the effect of necessity as well of ambition, nor is it easy to see how the various factions could at that time have been restrained without a mixture of military and arbitrary authority. The private deportment of Cromwell, as a son, a husband, a father, a friend, is exposed to no considerable censure, if it does not rather merit praise. And upon the whole, his character does not appear more extraordinary and unusual by the mixture of so much absurdity with so much penetration, than by his tempering such violent ambition and such enraged fanaticism with so much regard to justice and humanity. Cromwell was in the 59th year of his age when he died. He was of a robust frame of body, and of a manly, though not of an agreeable aspect. He left only 2 sons, Richard and Henry, and 3 daughters, one married to General Fleetwood, another to Lord Fauconberg, a third to Lord Rich. His father died when he was very young. His mother lived till after he was protector, and contrary to her orders, he buried her with great pomp in Westminster Abbey. She could not be persuaded that his power or person was ever in safety. At every noise which she heard, she exclaimed that her son was murdered, and was never satisfied that he was alive if she did not receive frequent visits from him. She was a decent woman, and by her frugality and industry had raised and educated a numerous family upon a small fortune. She had even been obliged to set up a brewery at Huntingdon, which she managed to good advantage. Hence Cromwell, in the invectives of that age, is often stigmatized with the name of the brewer. Ludlow, by way of insult, mentions the greatest accession which he would receive to his royal revenues upon his mother's death, who possessed a jointure of £60 a year upon his estate. She was of a good family of the name of Stuart, remotely allied, as is by some supposed, to the royal family. End of section 59, chapter 61, part 6. Recording by Greg Golding, Georgetown, Ontario, Canada.
Section 60 of Volume 1E of History of England from the Invasion of Julius Caesar to the Revolution of 1688. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England from the Invasion of Julius Caesar to the Revolution of 1688, by David Hume, Volume 1E, Section 60, Chapter 62, Part 1. Chapter 62. The Commonwealth. All the arts of Cromwell's policy had been so often practised, that they began to lose their effect, and his power, instead of being confirmed by time and success, seemed every day to become more uncertain and precarious. His friends the most closely connected with him, and his counsellors the most trusted, were entering into cabals against his authority, and with all his penetration into the characters of men, he could not find any ministers on whom he could rely. Men of probity and honour, he knew, would not submit to be the instruments of a usurpation violent and illegal. Those who were free from the restraint of principle, might betray, from interest, that cause in which, from no better motives, they had enlisted themselves. Even those on whom he conferred any favour, never deemed the recompense an equivalent for the sacrifices which they made to obtain it. Whoever was refused any demand, justified his anger by the specious colours of conscience and of duty. Such difficulties surrounded the Protector, that his dying at so critical a time is esteemed by many the most fortunate circumstance that ever attended him; and it was thought, that all his courage and dexterity could not much longer have extended his usurped administration. But when that potent hand was removed which conducted the government, every one expected a sudden dissolution of the unwieldy and ill-jointed fabric. Richard, a young man of no experience, educated in the country, accustomed to a retired life, unacquainted with the officers, and unknown to them, recommended by no military exploits, endeared by no familiarities, could not long, it was thought, maintain that authority which his father had acquired by so many valorous achievements and such signal successes. and when it was observed that he possessed only the virtues of private life, which in his situation were so many vices, that indolence, incapacity, irresolution, attended his facility and good nature, the various hopes of men were excited by the expectation of some great event or revolution. For some time, however, the public was disappointed in this opinion. The council recognized the succession of Richard. Fleetwood, in whose favour it was supposed Cromwell had formerly made a will, renounced all claim or pretension to the protectorship. Henry, Richard's brother, who governed Ireland with popularity, ensured him the obedience of that kingdom. Monk, whose authority was well established in Scotland, being much attached to the family of Cromwell, immediately proclaimed the new protector. The army, everywhere, the fleet, acknowledged his title. Above 90 addresses, from the counties and most considerable corporations, congratulated him on his accession, in all the terms of dutiful allegiance. Foreign ministers were forward in paying him the usual compliments; and Richard, whose moderate, unambitious character never would have led him to contend for empire, was tempted to accept so rich an inheritance, which seemed to be tendered to him by the consent of all mankind. It was found necessary to call a parliament, in order to furnish supplies, both for the ordinary administration, and for fulfilling those engagements with foreign princes, particularly Sweden, into which the late protector had entered. In hopes of obtaining greater influence in elections, the ancient right was restored to all the small boroughs, and the counties were allowed no more than their usual members. 1659. The House of Peers, or the other house, consisted of the same persons that had been appointed by Oliver. All the commons, at first, signed without hesitation an engagement not to alter the present government. They next proceeded to examine the humble petition and advice, and after great opposition and many vehement debates, it was at length, with much difficulty, carried by the court party to confirm it. An acknowledgment, too, of the authority of the other house, was extorted from them, though it was resolved not to treat this House of Peers with any greater respect than they should return to the Commons. A declaration was also made, that the establishment of the other house should nowise prejudice the right of such of the ancient peers as had from the beginning of the war adhered to the parliament. But in all these proceedings, the opposition among the commons was so considerable, and the debates were so much prolonged, that all business was retarded, and great alarm given to the partisans of the young protector. But there was another quarter from which greater dangers were justly apprehended. The most considerable officers of the army, and even Fleetwood, brother-in-law to the protector, were entering into cabals against him. No character in human society is more dangerous than that of the fanatic, because, if attended with weak judgment, he is exposed to the suggestions of others; if supported by more discernment, he is entirely governed by his own illusions, which sanctify his most selfish views and passions. Fleetwood was of the former species; and as he was extremely addicted to a republic, and even to the fifth monarchy or dominion of the saints, it was easy for those who had insinuated themselves into his confidence, to instill disgusts against the dignity of protector. The whole republican party in the army, which was still considerable, Fitz, Mason, Moss, Farley, united themselves to that general. The officers, too, of the same party, whom Cromwell had discarded, Overton, Ludlow, Rich, Okey, Alured, began to appear, and to recover that authority which had been only for a time suspended. A party, likewise, who found themselves eclipsed in Richard's favour, Sydenham, Kelsey, Barry, Haynes, joined the cabal of the others. Even Desborough, the protector's uncle, lent his authority to that faction. But above all, the intrigues of Lambert, who was now roused from his retreat, inflamed all those dangerous humours, and threatened the nation with some great convulsion. The discontented officers established their meetings in Fleetwood's apartments; and because he dwelt in Wallingford House, the party received a denomination from that place. Richard, who possessed neither resolution nor penetration, was prevailed on to give an unguarded consent for calling a general council of officers, who might make him proposals, as they pretended, for the good of the army. No sooner were they assembled than they voted a remonstrance. They there lamented, that the good old cause, as they termed it, that is, the cause for which they had engaged against the late king, was entirely neglected; and they proposed as a remedy, that the whole military power should be entrusted to some person in whom they might all confide. The city militia, influenced by two aldermen, Tichburn and Ireton, expressed the same resolution of adhering to the good old cause. The Protector was justly alarmed at those movements among the officers. The persons in whom he chiefly confided, were all of them, excepting Broghill, men of civil characters and professions: Fienne, Thurlow, Whitlock, Wolseley, who could only assist him with their advice and opinion. He possessed none of those arts which were proper to gain an enthusiastic army. Murmurs being thrown out against some promotions which he had made, "Would you have me," said he, "prefer none but the godly? Here is Dick Ingoldsby," continued he, "who can neither pray nor preach; yet will I trust him before ye all." This imprudence gave great offence to the pretended saints. The other qualities of the Protector were correspondent to these sentiments. He was of a gentle, humane, and generous disposition. Some of his party offering to put an end to those intrigues by the death of Lambert, he declared that he would not purchase power or dominion by such sanguinary measures. The parliament was no less alarmed at the military cabals. They voted that there should be no meeting or general council of officers, except with the Protector's consent, or by his orders. This vote brought affairs immediately to a rupture. The officers hastened to Richard, and demanded of him the dissolution of the parliament. Desborough, a man of a clownish and brutal nature, threatened him, if he should refuse compliance. The Protector wanted the resolution to deny, and possessed little ability to resist. The parliament was dissolved; and by the same act, the Protector was by every one considered as effectually dethroned. Soon after, he signed his demission in form. Henry, the deputy of Ireland, was endowed with the same moderate disposition as Richard; but as he possessed more vigor and capacity, it was apprehended that he might make resistance. His popularity in Ireland was great; and even his personal authority, notwithstanding his youth, was considerable. Had his ambition been very eager, he had, no doubt, been able to create disturbance; but being threatened by Sir Hardress Waller, Colonel John Jones, and other officers, he very quietly resigned his command, and retired to England. He had once entertained thoughts, which he had not resolution to execute, of proclaiming the king in Dublin. Thus fell, suddenly and from an enormous height, but, by a rare fortune, without any hurt or injury, the family of the Cromwells. Richard continued to possess an estate, which was moderate, and burdened too with a large debt, which he had contracted for the interment of his father. After the Restoration, though he remained unmolested, he thought proper to travel for some years; and at Pezenas, in Languedoc, he was introduced under a borrowed name to the Prince of Conti. That prince, talking of English affairs, broke out into admiration of Cromwell's courage and capacity. But as for that poor, pitiful fellow Richard, said he, what has become of him? How could he be such a blockhead as to reap no greater benefit from all his father's crimes and successes? Richard extended his peaceful and quiet life to an extreme old age, and died not till the latter end of Queen Anne's reign. His social virtues, more valuable than the greatest capacity, met with a recompense more precious than noisy fame, and more suitable: contentment and tranquillity. The council of officers, now possessed of supreme authority, deliberated what form of government they should establish. Many of them seemed inclined to exercise the power of the sword in the most open manner; but as it was apprehended that the people would with great difficulty be induced to pay taxes levied by arbitrary will and pleasure, it was agreed to preserve the shadow of civil administration, and to revive the Long Parliament, which had been expelled by Cromwell. That assembly could not be dissolved, it was asserted, but by their own consent; and violence had interrupted, but was not able to destroy, their right to government. The officers also expected, that as these members had sufficiently felt their own weakness, they would be contented to act in subordination to the military commanders, and would thenceforth allow all the authority to remain where the power was so visibly vested. The officers applied to Lenthal, the speaker, and proposed to him, that the parliament should resume their seats. Lenthal was of a low, timid spirit, and being uncertain what issue might attend these measures, was desirous of evading the proposal. He replied, that he could by no means comply with the desires of the officers, being engaged in a business of far greater importance to himself, which he could not omit on any account, because it concerned the salvation of his own soul. The officers pressed him to tell what it might be. He was preparing, he said, to participate of the Lord's Supper, which he resolved to take next Sabbath. They insisted, that mercy was preferable to sacrifice, and that he could not better prepare himself for that great duty, than by contributing so the public service. All their remonstrances had no effect. However, on the appointed day, the speaker, being informed that a quorum of the house was likely to meet, thought proper, notwithstanding the salvation of his soul, as Ludlow observes, to join them; and the house immediately proceeded upon business. The secluded members attempted, but in vain, to resume their seats among them. The numbers of this parliament were small, little exceeding 70 members. The authority in the nation, ever since they had been purged by the army, was extremely diminished; and, after their expulsion, had been totally annihilated. But being all of them men of violent ambition, some of them men of experience and capacity, they were resolved, since they enjoyed the title of the supreme authority, and observed that some appearance of a parliament was requisite for the purposes of the army, not to act a subordinate part to those who acknowledged themselves their servants. They chose a council, in which they took care that the officers of Wallingford House should not be the majority. They appointed Fleetwood lieutenant general, but inserted in his commission, that it should only continue during the pleasure of the house. They chose 7 persons, who should nominate to such commands as became vacant; and they voted, that all commissions should be received from the speaker, and be signed by him in the name of the house. These precautions, the tendency of which was visible, gave great disgust to the general officers; and their discontent would immediately have broken out into some resolution fatal to the parliament, had it not been checked by the apprehensions of danger from the common enemy. The bulk of the nation consisted of royalists and Presbyterians, and to both these parties the dominion of the pretended parliament had ever been to the last degree odious. When that assembly was expelled by Cromwell, contempt had succeeded to hatred. and no reserve had been used in expressing the utmost derision against the impotent ambition of these usurpers. Seeing them reinstated in authority, all orders of men felt the highest indignation, together with apprehensions, lest such tyrannical rulers should exert their power by taking vengeance upon their enemies, who had so openly insulted them. A secret reconciliation, therefore, was made between the rival parties, and it was agreed, that, burying former enmities in oblivion, all efforts should be used for the overthrow of the Rump. So they called the Parliament, in allusion to that part of the animal body. The Presbyterians, sensible from experience that their passion for liberty, however laudable, had carried them into unwarrantable excesses, were willing to lay aside ancient jealousies, and at all hazards to restore the royal family. The nobility, the gentry, bent their passionate endeavors to the same enterprise, by which alone they could be redeemed from slavery. And no man was so remote from party, so indifferent to public good, as not to feel the most ardent wishes for the dissolution of that tyranny, which, whether the civil or the military part of it were considered, appeared equally oppressive and ruinous to the nation. Mordaunt, who had so narrowly escaped on his trial before the High Court of Justice, seemed rather animated than daunted with past danger, and having by his resolute behavior obtained the highest confidence of the royal party, he was now become the centre of all their conspiracies. In many counties, a resolution was taken to rise in arms. Lord Willoughby of Parham and Sir Horatio Townshend undertook to secure Lynn. General Massey engaged to seize Gloucester. Lord Newport, Littleton, and other gentlemen, conspired to take possession of Shrewsbury. Sir George Booth of Chester, Sir Thomas Middleton of North Wales, Arundel, Pauler, Granville, Trelawney, of Plymouth and Exeter. A day was appointed for the execution of all these enterprises. And the king, attended by the Duke of York, had secretly arrived at Calais, with a resolution of putting himself at the head of his loyal subjects. The French court had promised to supply him with a small body of forces, in order to countenance the insurrections of the English. This combination was disconcerted by the infidelity of Sir Richard Willis. That traitor continued with the Parliament the same correspondence which he had begun with Cromwell. He had engaged to reveal all conspiracies, so far as to destroy their effect, but reserved to himself, if he pleased, the power of concealing the conspirators. He took care never to name any of the old genuine cavaliers, who had zealously adhered, and were resolved still to adhere, to the royal cause in every fortune. These men he esteemed. These he even loved. He betrayed only the new converts among the Presbyterians, or such lukewarm royalists as, discouraged with their disappointments, were resolved to expose themselves to no more hazards. A lively proof how impossible it is, even for the most corrupted minds, to divest themselves of all regard to morality and social duty. Many of the conspirators in the different counties were thrown into prison. Others, astonished at such symptoms of secret treachery, left their houses, or remained quiet. The most tempestuous weather prevailed during the whole time appointed for the rendezvous, insomuch that some found it impossible to join their friends, and others were dismayed with fear and superstition at an incident so unusual during the summer season. Of all the projects, the only one which took effect, was that of Sir George Booth for the seizing of Chester. The Earl of Derby, Lord Herbert of Cherbury, Mr. Lee, Colonel Morgan, entered into this enterprise. Sir William Middleton joined Booth with some troops from North Wales, and the malcontents were powerful enough to subdue all in that neighborhood who ventured to oppose them. In their declaration they made no mention of the king. they only demanded a free and full Parliament. The Parliament was justly alarmed. How combustible the materials, they well knew, and the fire was now fallen among them. Booth was of a family eminently Presbyterian, and his conjunction with the royalists they regarded as a dangerous symptom. They had many officers whose fidelity they could more depend on than that of Lambert, but there was no one in whose vigilance and capacity they reposed such confidence. They commissioned him to suppress the rebels. He made incredible haste. Booth imprudently ventured himself out of the walls of Chester, and exposed, in the open field, his raw troops against these hardy veterans. He was soon routed and taken prisoner. His whole army was dispersed. And the Parliament had no further occupation than to fill all the jails with their open or secret enemies. Designs were even entertained of transporting the loyal families to Barbados, Jamaica, and the other colonies, lest they should propagate in England children of the same malignant affections with themselves. This success hastened the ruin of the Parliament. Lambert, at the head of a body of troops, was no less dangerous to them than Booth. £1,000, which they sent him to buy a jewel, were employed by him in liberalities to his officers. At his instigation, they drew up a petition, and transmitted it to Fleetwood, a weak man, and an honest, if sincerity in folly deserve that honourable name. The import of this petition was, that Fleetwood should be made commander-in-chief, Lambert major-general, Desborough lieutenant-general of the horse, Monk major-general of the foot. To which a demand was added, that no officer should be dismissed from his command but by a court-martial. The Parliament, alarmed at the danger, immediately cashiered Lambert, Desborough, Berry, Clark, Barrow, Kelsey, Cobbett. Sir Arthur Hazelrig proposed the impeachment of Lambert for high treason. Fleetwood's commission was vacated, and the command of the army was vested in 7 persons, of whom that general was one. The Parliament voted, that they would have no more general officers. And they declared it high treason to levy any money without consent of Parliament. But these votes were feeble weapons in opposition to the swords of the soldiery. Lambert drew some troops together, in order to decide the controversy. Okey, who was leading his regiment to the assistance of the Parliament, was deserted by them. Morley and Moss brought their regiments into Palace Yard, resolute to oppose the violence of Lambert. But that artful general knew an easy way of disappointing them. He placed his soldiers in the streets which led to Westminster Hall. When the speaker came in his coach, he ordered the horses to be turned, and very civilly conducted him home. The other members were in like manner intercepted. And the 2 regiments in Palace Yard, observing that they were exposed to derision, peaceably retired to their quarters. A little before this bold enterprise, a solemn fast had been kept by the army, and it is remarked, that this ceremony was the usual prelude to every signal violence which they committed. End of Section 60, Chapter 62, Part 1. Section 61 of Volume 1E of History of England from the Invasion of Julius Caesar to the Revolution of 1688. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England from the Invasion of Julius Caesar to the Revolution of 1688, by David Hume, Volume 1E, Section 61, Chapter 62, Part 2. the officers found themselves again invested with supreme authority, of which they intended forever to retain the substance, however they might bestow on others the empty shadow or appearance. They elected a committee of 23 persons, of whom 7 were officers. These they pretended to invest with sovereign authority, and they called them a Committee of Safety. They spoke everywhere of summoning a parliament chosen by the people, but they really took some steps towards assembling a military parliament, composed of officers elected from every regiment in the service. Throughout the 3 kingdoms there prevailed nothing but the melancholy fears, to the nobility and gentry, of a bloody massacre and extermination; to the rest of the people, of perpetual servitude beneath those sanctified robbers, whose union and whose divisions would be equally destructive and who, under pretence of superior illuminations, would soon extirpate, if possible, all private morality, as they had already done all public law and justice, from the British dominions. During the time that England continued in this distracted condition, the other kingdoms of Europe were hastening towards a composure of those differences by which they had so long been agitated. The parliament, while it preserved authority, instead of following the imprudent politics of Cromwell, and lending assistance to the conquering Swede, embraced the maxims of the Dutch Commonwealth, and resolved, in conjunction with that state, to mediate by force an accommodation between the northern crowns. Montague was sent with a squadron to the Baltic, and carried with him, as ambassador, Algernon Sidney, the celebrated republican. Sidney found the Swedish monarch employed in the siege of Copenhagen, the capital of his enemy, and was highly pleased that, with a Roman arrogance, he could check the progress of royal victories, and display in so signal a manner the superiority of freedom above tyranny. With the highest indignation, the ambitious prince was obliged to submit to the imperious mediation of the 2 commonwealths. "It is cruel," said he, "that laws should be prescribed me by parricides and pedlars." But his whole army was enclosed in an island, and might be starved by the combined squadrons of England and Holland. He was obliged therefore to quit his prey, when he had so nearly gotten possession of it; and having agreed to a pacification with Denmark, he retired into his own country, where he soon after died. The wars between France and Spain were also concluded by the Treaty of the Pyrenees. These animosities had long been carried on between the rival states, even while governed by a sister and brother, who cordially loved and esteemed each other. But politics, which had so long prevailed over these friendly affections, now at last yielded to their influence; and never was the triumph more full and complete. The Spanish Low Countries, if not every part of that monarchy, lay almost entirely at the mercy of its enemy. Broken armies, disordered finances, slow and irresolute counsels by these resources alone were the dispersed provinces of Spain defended against the vigorous power of France. But the Queen Regent, anxious for the fate of her brother, employed her authority with the cardinal to stop the progress of the French conquests, and put an end to a quarrel which, being commenced by ambition, and attended with victory, was at last concluded with moderation. The young monarch of France, though aspiring and warlike in his character, was at this time entirely occupied in the pleasures of love and gallantry, and had passively resigned the reins of empire into the hands of his politic minister. And he remained an unconcerned spectator, while an opportunity for conquest was parted with, which he never was able, during the whole course of his active reign, fully to retrieve. The ministers of the 2 crowns, Mazarin and Don Louis de Haro, met at the foot of the Pyrenees, in the Isle of Pheasants, a place which was supposed to belong to neither kingdom. the negotiation being brought to an issue by frequent conferences between the ministers, the monarchs themselves agreed to a congress; and these two splendid courts appeared in their full lustre amidst those savage mountains. Philip brought his daughter, Mary Therese, along with him, and giving her in marriage to his nephew Louis, endeavored to cement by this new tie the incompatible interests of the two monarchies. The French king made a solemn renunciation of every succession which might accrue to him in right of his consort; a vain formality, too weak to restrain the ungoverned ambition of princes. The affairs of England were in so great disorder, that it was not possible to comprehend that kingdom in the treaty, or adjust measures with a power which was in such incessant fluctuation. The king, reduced to despair by the failure of all enterprises for his restoration, was resolved to try the weak resource of foreign succours; and he went to the Pyrenees at the time when the two ministers were in the midst of their negotiations. Don Louis received him with that generous civility peculiar to his nation; and expressed great inclination, had the low condition of Spain allowed him, to give assistance to the distressed monarch. The cautious Mazarin, pleading the alliance of France with the English Commonwealth, refused even to see him; and though the king offered to marry the cardinal's niece, he could for the present obtain nothing but empty profusions of respect and protestations of services. The condition of that monarch, to all the world, seemed totally desperate. His friends had been baffled in every attempt for his service; the scaffold had often streamed with the blood of the more active royalists; the spirits of many were broken with tedious imprisonments; the estates of all were burdened by the fines and confiscations which had been levied upon them; no one durst openly avow himself of that party; and so small did their number seem to a superficial view, that, even should the nation recover its liberty, which was deemed nowise probable, it was judged uncertain what form of government it would embrace. But amidst all these gloomy prospects, fortune, by a surprising revolution, was now paving the way for the king to mount, in peace and triumph, the throne of his ancestors. It was by the prudence and loyalty of General Monk that this happy change was at last accomplished. George Monk, to whom the fate was reserved of re-establishing monarchy, and finishing the bloody dissensions of three kingdoms, was the second son of a family in Devonshire, ancient and honourable, but lately, from too great hospitality and expense, somewhat fallen to decay. He betook himself in early youth to the profession of arms; and was engaged in the unfortunate expeditions to Cadiz and the Isle of Rhe. After England had concluded peace with all her neighbours, he sought military experience in the Low Countries, the great school of war to all the European nations; and he rose to the command of a company under Lord Goring. This company consisted of 200 men, of whom 100 were volunteers, often men of family and fortune, sometimes noblemen, who lived upon their own income in a splendid manner. Such a military turn at that time prevailed among the English. When the sound of war was first heard in this island, Monk returned to England, partly desirous of promotion in his native country, partly disgusted with some ill usage from the states, of which he found reason to complain. Upon the Scottish pacification, he was employed by the Earl of Leicester against the Irish rebels; and having obtained a regiment, was soon taken notice of for his military skill, and for his calm and deliberate valor. Without ostentation, expense, or caresses, merely by his humane and equal temper, he gained the goodwill of the soldiery, who, with a mixture of familiarity and affection, usually called him honest George Monk, an honourable appellation, which they still continued to him even during his greatest elevation. He was remarkable for his moderation in party. and while all around him were inflamed into rage against the opposite faction, he fell under suspicion from the candour and tranquillity of his behaviour. When the Irish army was called over into England, surmises of this kind had been so far credited, that he had even been suspended from his command, and ordered to Oxford, that he might answer the charge laid against him. His established character for truth and sincerity here stood him in great stead; and upon his earnest protestations and declarations, he was soon restored to his regiment, which he joined at the siege of Nantwich. The day after his arrival, Fairfax attacked and defeated the royalists commanded by Biron, and took Colonel Monk prisoner. He was sent to the Tower, where he endured, above 2 years, all the rigours of poverty and confinement. The king, however, was so mindful as to send him, notwithstanding his own difficulties, a present of 100 guineas; but it was not till after the royalists were totally subdued that he recovered his liberty. Monk, however distressed, had always refused the most inviting offers from the parliament; but Cromwell, sensible of his merit, having solicited him to engage in the wars against the Irish, who were considered as rebels both by king and parliament, he was not unwilling to repair his broken fortunes by accepting a command which, he flattered himself, was reconcilable to the strictest principles of honor. Having once engaged with the parliament, he was obliged to obey orders; and found himself necessitated to fight both against the Marquis of Ormond in Ireland, and against the king himself in Scotland. Upon the reduction of the latter kingdom, Monk was left with supreme command; and by the equality and justice of his administration, he was able to give contentment to that restless people, now reduced to subjugation by a nation whom they hated. No less acceptable was his authority to the officers and soldiers; and foreseeing that the goodwill of the army under his command might some time be of great service to him, he had with much care and success cultivated their friendship. The connections which he had formed with Cromwell, his benefactor, preserved him faithful to Richard, who had been enjoined by his father to follow in everything the directions of General Monk. When the Long Parliament was restored, Monk, who was not prepared for opposition, acknowledged their authority, and was continued in his command, from which it would not have been safe to attempt dislodging him. After the army had expelled the parliament, he protested against the violence, and resolved, as he pretended, to vindicate their invaded privileges. Deeper designs, either in the king's favor or his own, were from the beginning suspected to be the motive of his actions. A rivalship had long subsisted between him and Lambert; and everybody saw the reason why he opposed the elevation of that ambitious general, by whose success his own authority, he knew, would soon be subverted. But little friendship had ever subsisted between him and the parliamentary leaders; and it seemed nowise probable that he intended to employ his industry, and spend his blood, for the advancement of one enemy above another. How early he entertained designs for the king's restoration, we know not with certainty. It is likely that, as soon as Richard was deposed, he foresaw that, without such an expedient, it would be impossible ever to bring the nation to a regular settlement. His elder and younger brothers were devoted to the royal cause; the Granvilles, his near relations, and all the rest of his kindred, were in the same interests. He himself was intoxicated with no fumes of enthusiasm, and had maintained no connection with any of the fanatical tribe. His early engagements had been with the king; and he had left that service without receiving any disgust from the royal family. Since he had enlisted himself with the opposite party, he had been guilty of no violence or rigor which might render him obnoxious. His return, therefore, to loyalty, was easy and open; and nothing could be supposed to counterbalance his natural propensity to that measure, except the views of his own elevation, and the prospect of usurping the same grandeur and authority which had been assumed by Cromwell. But from such exorbitant, if not impossible projects, the natural tranquillity and moderation of his temper, the calmness and solidity of his genius, not to mention his age, now upon the decline, seem to have set him at a distance. Cromwell himself, he always asserted, could not long have maintained his usurpation, and any other person, even equal to him in genius, it was obvious, would now find it more difficult to practice arts of which every one from experience was sufficiently aware. It was more agreeable, therefore, to reason as well as candor, to suppose, that Monk, as soon as he put himself in motion, had entertained views of effecting the king's restoration; nor ought any objections, derived from his profound silence even to Charles himself, to be regarded as considerable. His temper was naturally reserved; his circumstances required dissimulation; the king, he knew, was surrounded with spies and traitors; and, upon the whole, it seems hard to interpret that conduct which ought to exalt our idea of his prudence, as a disparagement of his probity. Sir John Granville, hoping that the general would engage in the king's service, sent into Scotland his younger brother, a clergyman, Dr. Monk, who carried him a letter and invitation from the king. When the doctor arrived, he found that his brother was then holding a council of officers, and was not to be seen for some hours. In the meantime, he was received and entertained by Price, the general's chaplain, a man of probity, as well as a partisan of the king's. The doctor, having an entire confidence in the chaplain, talked very freely to him about the object of his journey, and engaged him, if there should be occasion, to second his applications. At last, the general arrives; the brothers embrace; and after some preliminary conversation, the doctor opens his business. Monk interrupted him, to know whether he had ever before to anybody mentioned the subject. "To nobody," replied his brother, "but to Price, whom I know to be entirely in your confidence." The general, altering his countenance, turned the discourse; and would enter into no further confidence with him, but sent him away with the first opportunity. He would not trust his own brother the moment he knew that he had disclosed the secret, though to a man whom he himself could have trusted. His conduct in all other particulars was full of the same reserve and prudence; and no less was requisite for effecting the difficult work which he had undertaken. All the officers in his army of whom he entertained any suspicion, he immediately cashiered. Cobbett, who had been sent by the Committee of Safety, under pretence of communicating their resolutions to Monk, but really with a view of debauching his army, he committed to custody; he drew together the several scattered regiments; he summoned an assembly somewhat resembling a convention of states; and having communicated to them his resolution of marching into England, he received a seasonable, though no great supply of money. Hearing that Lambert was advancing northward with his army, Monk sent Cloberry and 2 other commissioners to London, with large professions of his inclination to peace, and with offers of terms for an accommodation. His chief aim was to gain time, and relax the preparations of his enemies. The Committee of Safety fell into the snare. A treaty was signed by Monk's commissioners; but he refused to ratify it, and complained that they had exceeded their powers. He desired, however, to enter into a new negotiation at Newcastle. The committee willingly accepted this fallacious offer. Meanwhile these military sovereigns found themselves surrounded on all hands with inextricable difficulties. The nation had fallen into total anarchy; and by refusing the payment of all taxes, reduced the army to the greatest necessities. While Lambert's forces were assembling at Newcastle, Hazelrig and Morley took possession of Portsmouth, and declared for the Parliament. A party, sent to suppress them, was persuaded by their commander to join in the same declaration. The city apprentices rose in a tumult, and demanded a free Parliament. Though they were suppressed by Colonel Hewson, a man who from the profession of a cobbler had risen to a high rank in the army, the city still discovered symptoms of the most dangerous discontent. It even established a kind of separate government, and assumed the supreme authority within itself. Admiral Lawson with his squadron came into the river, and declared for the Parliament. Hazelrig and Morley, hearing of this important event, left Portsmouth, and advanced towards London. The regiments near that city, being solicited by their old officers, who had been cashiered by the Committee of Safety, revolted again to the Parliament. Desborough's regiment, being sent by Lambert to support his friends, no sooner arrived at St. Albans, than it declared for the same assembly. Fleetwood's hand was found too weak and unstable to support this ill-founded fabric, which everywhere around him was falling into ruins. When he received intelligence of any murmurs among the soldiers, he would prostrate himself in prayer, and could hardly be prevailed with to join the troops. Even when among them, he would, in the midst of any discourse, invite them all to prayer, and put himself on his knees before them. If any of his friends exhorted him to more vigor, they could get no other answer than, that God had spitten in his face, and would not hear him. Men now ceased to wonder why Lambert had promoted him to the office of general, and had contented himself with the second command in the army. Lenthal, the speaker, being invited by the officers, again assumed authority, and summoned together the Parliament, which twice before had been expelled with so much reproach and ignominy. As soon as assembled, they repealed their act against the payment of excise and customs. They appointed commissioners for assigning quarters to the army, and, without taking any notice of Lambert, they sent orders to the forces under his command immediately to repair to those quarters which were appointed them. 1660. Lambert was now in a very disconsolate condition. Monk, he saw, had passed the Tweed at Coldstream, and was advancing upon him. His own soldiers deserted him in great multitudes, and joined the enemy. Lord Fairfax, too, he heard, had raised forces behind him, and had possessed himself of York, without declaring his purpose. The last orders of the Parliament so entirely stripped him of his army, that there remained not with him above 100 horse. All the rest went to their quarters with quietness and resignation, and he himself was, some time after, arrested and committed to the Tower. The other officers, who had formerly been cashiered by the Parliament, and who had resumed their commands that they might subdue that assembly, were again cashiered and confined to their houses. Sir Harry Vane and some members who had concurred with the Committee of Safety were ordered into a like confinement. And the Parliament now seemed to be again possessed of more absolute authority than ever, and to be without any danger of opposition or control. The Republican party was at this time guided by two men, Hazelrig and Vane, who were of opposite characters, and mortally hated each other. Hazelrig, who possessed greater authority in the Parliament, was haughty, imperious, precipitate, vainglorious, without civility, without prudence, qualified only by his noisy, pertinacious obstinacy to acquire an ascendant in public assemblies. Vane was noted in all civil transactions for temper, insinuation, address, and a profound judgment; in all religious speculations, for folly and extravagance. He was a perfect enthusiast; and fancying that he was certainly favored with inspiration, he deemed himself, to speak in the language of the times, to be a man above ordinances, and, by reason of his perfection, to be unlimited and unrestrained by any rules which govern inferior mortals. These whimsies, mingling with pride, had so corrupted his excellent understanding, that sometimes he thought himself the person deputed to reign on earth for 1,000 years over the whole congregation of the faithful. End of Section 61, Chapter 62, Part 2.
Section 62 of Volume 1E of History of England, from the Invasion of Julius Caesar to the Revolution of 1688. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by JamesMcAndrew. History of England from the Invasion of Julius Caesar to the Revolution of 1688 by David Hume. Volume 1E, Section 62, Chapter 62, Part 3. Monk, though informed of the restoration of the Parliament from whom he received no orders, still advanced with his army, which was near 6,000 men. The scattered forces in England were about 5 times more numerous. Fairfax, who had resolved to declare for the king, not being able to make the general open his intentions, retired to his own house in Yorkshire. In all counties through which Monk passed, the prime gentry flocked to him with addresses, expressing their earnest desire that he would be instrumental in restoring the nation to peace and tranquillity, and to the enjoyment of those liberties which by law were their birthright, but of which during so many years they had been fatally bereaved, and that in order to this salutary purpose he would prevail either for the restoring of those members who had been secluded before the king's death, or for the election of a new parliament, who might legally and by general consent again govern the nation. Though Monk pretended not to favour these addresses, that ray of hope which the knowledge of his character and situation afforded mightily animated all men. The tyranny and the anarchy which now equally oppressed the kingdom, the experience of past distractions, the dread of future convulsions, the indignation against military usurpation, against sanctified hypocrisy, all these motives had united every party, except the most desperate, into ardent wishes for the king's restoration, the only remedy for all these fatal evils. Scott and Robinson were sent as deputies by the Parliament, under pretence of congratulating the general, but in reality to serve as spies upon him. The city dispatched 4 of their principal citizens to perform like compliments, and at the same time to confirm the general in his inclination to a free parliament, the object of all men's prayers and endeavours. The authority of Monk could scarcely secure the parliamentary deputies from those insults which the general hatred and contempt toward their masters drew from men of every rank and denomination. Monk continued his march with few interruptions till he reached St. Albans. He there sent a message to the Parliament, desiring them to remove from London those regiments which, though they now professed to return to their duty, had so lately offered violence to that assembly. This message was unexpected, and exceedingly perplexed the House. Their fate, they found, must still depend on a mercenary army, and they were as distant as ever from their imaginary sovereignty. However, they found it necessary to comply. The soldiers made more difficulty. A mutiny arose among them. One regiment in particular, quartered in Somerset House, expressly refused to yield their place to the Northern army, but those officers who would gladly on such an occasion have inflamed the quarrel were absent or in confinement, and for want of leaders the soldiers were at last, with great reluctance, obliged to submit. Monk, with his army, took quarters in Westminster. The general was introduced to the House, and thanks were given him by Lenthal for the eminent services which he had done his country. Monk was a prudent, not an eloquent speaker. He told the House that the services which he had been enabled to perform were no more than his duty, and merited not such praises as those with which they were pleased to honour him, that among many persons of greater worth who bore their commission, he had been employed as the instrument of Providence for effecting their restoration. But he considered this service as a step only to more important services, which it was their part to render to the nation, that while on his march he observed all ranks of men in all places to be in earnest expectation of a settlement after the violent convulsions to which they had been exposed, and to have no prospect of that blessing but from the dissolution of the present Parliament, and from the summoning of a new one, free and full, who, meeting without oaths or engagements, might finally give contentment to the nation, that applications had been made to him for that purpose, but that he, sensible of his duty, had still told the petitioners that the Parliament itself, which was now free and would soon be full, was the best judge of all these measures, and that the whole community ought to acquiesce in their determination, that though he expressed himself in this manner to the people, he must now freely inform the House that the fewer engagements were exacted, the more comprehensive would their plan prove, and the more satisfaction would it give to the nation, and that it was sufficient for public security if the fanatical party and the royalists were excluded, since the principles of these factions were destructive either of government or of liberty. This speech, containing matter which was both agreeable and disagreeable to the House as well as to the nation, still kept everyone in suspense, and upheld that uncertainty in which it seemed the general's interest to retain the public. But it was impossible for the kingdom to remain long in this doubtful situation. The people, as well as the Parliament, pushed matters to a decision. During the late convulsions, the payment of taxes had been interrupted, and though the Parliament, upon their assembling, renewed the ordinances for imposition, yet so little reverence did the people pay to those legislators that they gave very slow and unwilling obedience to their commands. The Common Council of London flatly refused to submit to an assessment required of them, and declared that, till a free and lawful Parliament imposed taxes, they never should deem it their duty to make any payment. This resolution, if yielded to, would immediately have put an end to the dominion of the Parliament. They were determined, therefore, upon this occasion, to make at once a full experiment of their own power and of their general's obedience. Monk received orders to march into the city, to seize 12 persons, the most obnoxious to the Parliament, to remove the posts and chains from all the streets, and to take down and break the portcullises and gates of the city. And very few hours were allowed him to deliberate upon the execution of these violent orders. To the great surprise and consternation of all men, Monk prepared himself for obedience, neglecting the entreaties of his friends, the remonstrances of his officers, the cries of the people. He entered the city in a military manner. He apprehended as many as he could of the proscribed persons whom he sent to the Tower. With all the circumstances of contempt, he broke the gates and portcullises, and having exposed the city to the scorn and derision of all who hated it, he returned in triumph to his quarters in Westminster. No sooner had the general leisure to reflect than he found that this last measure, instead of being a continuation of that cautious ambiguity which he had hitherto maintained, was taking party without reserve, and laying himself as well as the nation at the mercy of that tyrannical parliament, whose power had long been odious as their persons contemptible to all men. He resolved, therefore, before it were too late, to repair the dangerous mistake into which he had been betrayed, and to show the whole world, still more without reserve, that he meant no longer to be the minister of violence and usurpation. After complaining of the odious service in which he had been employed, he wrote a letter to the House, reproaching them, as well with the new cabals which they had formed with Vane and Lambert, as with the encouragement given to a fanatical petition presented by, praise God, Barebone, and he required them, in the name of the citizens, soldiers, and whole Commonwealth, to issue writs within a week for the filling of their House, and to fix the time for their own dissolution and the assembling of a new Parliament. Having dispatched this letter, which might be regarded, he thought, as an undoubted pledge of his sincerity, he marched with his army into the city, and desired Allen, the mayor, to summon a common council at Guildhall. He there made many apologies for the indignity which 2 days before he had been obliged to put upon them, assured them of his perseverance in the measures which he had adopted, and desired that they might mutually plight their faith for a strict union between city and army in every enterprise for the happiness and settlement of the Commonwealth. It would be difficult to describe the joy and exultation which displayed itself throughout the city as soon as intelligence was conveyed of this happy measure embraced by the general. The prospect of peace, concord, liberty, justice broke forth at once from amidst the deepest darkness in which the nation had ever been involved. The few of past calamities no longer presented dismal prognostics of the future. It tended only to enhance the general exultation for those scenes of happiness and tranquillity which all men now confidently promised themselves. The Royalists, the Presbyterians, forgetting all animosities, mingled in common joy and transport, and vowed never more to gratify the ambition of false and factious tyrants by their calamitous divisions. The populace, more outrageous in their festivity, made the air resound with acclamations and illuminated every street with signals of jollity and triumph. Applauses of the general were everywhere intermingled with detestation against the Parliament. The most ridiculous inventions were adopted in order to express this latter passion. At every bonfire, rumps were roasted, and where these could no longer be found, pieces of flesh were cut into that shape. And the funeral of the Parliament, the populace exclaimed, was celebrated by these symbols of hatred and derision. The Parliament, though in the agonies of despair, made still one effort for the recovery of their dominion. They sent a committee with offers to gain the general. He refused to hear them, except in the presence of some of the secluded members. Though several persons, desperate from guilt and fanaticism, promised to invest him with the dignity of supreme magistrate and to support his government, he would not hearken to such wild proposals. Having fixed a close correspondence with the city and established its militia in hands whose fidelity could be relied on, he returned with his army to Westminster and pursued every proper measure for the settlement of the nation. While he still pretended to maintain republican principles, he was taking large steps toward the re-establishment of the ancient monarchy. The secluded members, under the general's invitation, went to the house, and finding no longer any obstruction, they entered, and immediately appeared to be the majority. Most of the independents left the place. The restored members first repealed all the ordinances by which they had been excluded. They gave Sir George Booth and his party their liberty and estates. They renewed the general's commission and enlarged his powers. They fixed an assessment for the support of the fleet and army, and having passed these votes for the present composure of the kingdom, they dissolved themselves and issued writs for the immediate assembling of a new parliament. This last measure had been previously concerted with the general, who knew that all men, however different in affections, expectations, and designs, united in their detestation of the Long Parliament. A council of state was established, consisting of men of character and moderation, most of whom, during the civil wars, had made a great figure among the Presbyterians. The militia of the kingdom was put into such hands as would promote order and settlement. These, conjoined with Monk's army, which lay united at London, were esteemed a sufficient check on the more numerous though dispersed army, of whose inclinations there was still much reason to be diffident. Monk, however, was every day removing the more obnoxious officers and bringing the troops to a state of discipline and obedience. Overton, governor of Hull, had declared his resolution to keep possession of that fortress till the coming of King Jesus. But when Alured produced the authority of Parliament for his delivering the place to Colonel Fairfax, he thought properly to comply. Montague, who commanded the fleet in the Baltic, had entered into the conspiracy with Sir George Booth, and pretending want of provisions, had sailed from the Sound towards the coast of England, with an intention of supporting that insurrection of the royalists. On his arrival, he received the news of Booth's defeat and the total failure of the enterprise. The great difficulties to which the Parliament was then reduced allowed them no leisure to examine strictly the reasons which he gave for quitting his station, and they allowed him to retire peaceably to his country house. The Council of State now conferred on him, in conjunction with Monk, the command of the fleet, and secured the naval as well as military force in hands favourable to the public settlement. Notwithstanding all these steps which were taken towards the re-establishment of the monarchy, Monk still maintained the appearance of zeal for a commonwealth, and hitherto allowed no canal of correspondence between himself and the king to be opened. To call a free parliament and to restore the royal family were visibly, in the present disposition of the kingdom, one and the same measure. Yet would not the general declare, otherwise than by his actions, that he had adopted the king's interests, and nothing but necessity extorted at last the confession from him. His silence in the commencement of his enterprise ought to be no objection to his sincerity, since he maintained the same reserve at a time when, consistent with common sense, he could have entertained no other purpose. There was one Morris, a gentleman of Devonshire, of a sedentary, studious disposition, nearly related to Monk, and one who had always maintained the strictest intimacy with him. With this friend alone did Monk deliberate concerning that great enterprise which he had projected. Sir John Granville, who had a commission from the king, applied to Maurice for access to the general, but received for answer that the general desired him to communicate his business to Maurice. Granville, though importunately urged, twice refused to deliver his message to any but Monk himself, and this cautious politician, finding him now a person whose secrecy could be safely trusted, admitted him to his presence, and opened to him his whole intentions. Since he scrupled to commit anything to writing, he delivered only a verbal message by Granville assuring the king of his services, giving advice for his conduct, and exhorting him instantly to leave the Spanish territories and retire into Holland. He was apprehensive lest Spain might detain him as a pledge for the recovery of Dunkirk and Jamaica. Charles followed these directions and very narrowly escaped to Breda. Had he protracted his journey a few hours, he had certainly, under pretense of honor and respect, been arrested by the Spaniards. Lockhart, who was governor of Dunkirk, and nowise averse to the king's service, was applied to on this occasion. The state of England was set before him, the certainty of the restoration represented, and the prospect of great favour displayed, if he would anticipate the vows of the kingdom and receive the king into his fortress. Lockhart still replied that his commission was derived from an English parliament, and he would not open his gates but in obedience to the same authority. This scruple, though in the present emergence it approaches towards superstition, it is difficult for us entirely to condemn. The elections for the new parliament went everywhere in favour of the king's party. This was one of those popular torrents where the most indifferent or even the most averse are transported with the general passion and zealously adopt the sentiments of the community to which they belong. The enthusiasts themselves seem to be disarmed of their fury, and between despair and astonishment gave way to those measures which they found it would be impossible for them by their utmost efforts to withstand. The Presbyterians and the Royalists, being united, formed the voice of the nation, which without noise but with infinite ardour called for the king's restoration. The kingdom was almost entirely in the hands of the former party, and some zealous leaders among them began to renew the demand of those conditions which had been required of the late king in the Treaty of Newport. But the general opinion seemed to condemn all those rigorous and jealous capitulations with their sovereign. Harassed with convulsions and disorders, men ardently longed for repose and were terrified at the mention of negotiations or delays, which might afford opportunity to the seditious army still to breed new confusion. The passion, too, for liberty, having been carried to such violent extremes, and having produced such bloody commotions, began by a natural movement to give place to a spirit of loyalty and obedience, and the public was less zealous in a cause which was become odious on account of the calamities which had so long attended it. After the legal concessions made by the late king, the Constitution seemed to be sufficiently secured, and the additional conditions insisted on, as they had been framed during the greatest ardour of the contest, amounted rather to annihilation than a limitation of monarchy. Above all, the general was averse to the mention of conditions, and resolved that the crown which he intended to restore should be conferred on the king entirely free and unencumbered. Without further scruple, therefore, or jealousy, the people gave their voice in elections for such as they knew to entertain sentiments favourable to monarchy, and all paid court to a party which they foresaw was soon to govern the nation. Though the Parliament had voted that no one should be elected who had himself or whose father had borne arms for the late king, little regard was anywhere paid to this ordinance. The leaders of the Presbyterians, the Earl of Manchester, Lord Fairfax, Lord Robarts, Hollis, Sir Anthony Ashley Cooper, Annesley, Lewis, were determined to atone for past transgressions by their present zeal for the royal interests, and from former merits, successes, and sufferings they had acquired with their party the highest credit and authority. The affairs of Ireland were in a condition no less favourable to the king. As soon as Monk declared against the English army, he dispatched emissaries into Ireland and engaged the officers in that kingdom to concur with him in the same measures. Lord Broghill, President of Munster, and Sir Charles Cote, President of Connaught, went so far as to enter into a correspondence with the king, and to promise their assistance for his restoration. In conjunction with Sir Theophilus Jones and other officers, they took possession of the government, and excluded Ludlow, who was zealous for the Rump Parliament, but whom they pretended to be in a confederacy with the Committee of Safety. They kept themselves in readiness to serve the king, but made no declarations till they should see the turn which affairs took in England. But all these promising views had almost been blasted by an untoward accident. Upon the admission of the secluded members, the Republican party, particularly the late king's judges, were seized with the justest despair, and endeavoured to infuse the same sentiment into the army. By themselves or their emissaries they represented to the soldiers that all those brave actions which had been performed during the war, and which were so meritorious in the eyes of the Parliament, would no doubt be regarded as the deepest crimes by the royalists, and would expose the army to the severest vengeance. That in vain did that party make professions of moderation and lenity. The king's death, the execution of so many of the nobility and gentry, the sequestration and imprisonment of the rest, were in their eyes crimes so deep and offences so personal as must be prosecuted with the most implacable resentment, that the loss of all arrears and the cashiering of every officer and soldier were the lightest punishment which must be expected. After the dissolution of the army, no further protection remained to them, either for life or property, but the clemency of enraged victors, and that, even if the most perfect security could be obtained, it were inglorious to be reduced by treachery and deceit to subjection under a foe who in the open field had so long yielded to their superior valour. End of section 62, chapter 62, part 3. Recording by James McAndrew, San Francisco. As
Section 63 of Volume 1E of History of England from the Invasion of Julius Caesar to the Revolution of 1688. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Golding. History of England from the Invasion of Julius Caesar to the Revolution of 1688 by David Hume, Volume 1E, Section 63, Chapter 62, Part 4. After these suggestions had been infused into the army, Lambert suddenly made his escape from the Tower, and threw Monk and the Council of State into great consternation. They knew Lambert's vigour and activity. They were acquainted with his popularity in the army. They were sensible that, though the soldiers had lately deserted him, they sufficiently expressed their remorse, and their detestation of those who, by false professions, they found had so egregiously deceived them. It seemed necessary, therefore, to employ the greatest celerity in suppressing so dangerous a foe. Colonel Ingoldsby, who had been one of the late king's judges, but who was now entirely engaged in the royal cause, was dispatched after him. He overtook him at Daventry, while he had yet assembled but 4 troops of horse. One of them deserted him. Another quickly followed the example. He himself, endeavouring to make his escape, was seized by Ingoldsby, to whom he made submissions not suitable to his former character of spirit and valour. Okey, Axtell, Cobbett, Creed, and other officers of that party were taken prisoners with him. All the roads were full of soldiers hastening to join them. In a few days they had been formidable, and it was thought that it might prove dangerous for Monk himself to have assembled any considerable body of his republican army for their suppression, so that nothing could be more happy than the sudden extinction of this rising flame. When the Parliament met, they chose Sir Harbottle Grimstone Speaker, a man who, though he had for some time concurred with the late Parliament, had long been esteemed affectionate to the king's service. The great dangers incurred during former usurpations, joined to the extreme caution of the general, kept every one in awe, and none dared for some days to make any mention of the king. The members exerted their spirit chiefly in bitter invectives against the memory of Cromwell, and in execrations against the inhuman murder of their late sovereign. At last the general, having sufficiently sounded their inclinations, gave directions to Annesley, president of the council, to inform them that one Sir John Granville, a servant of the king's, had been sent over by his majesty, and was now at the door with a letter to the commons. The loudest acclamations were excited by this intelligence. Granville was called in. The letter, accompanied with a declaration, greedily read, without one moment's delay, and without a contradictory vote. A committee was appointed to prepare an answer, and in order to spread the same satisfaction throughout the kingdom, it was voted that the letter and declaration should immediately be published. The people, freed from the state of suspense in which they had so long been held, now changed their anxious hope for the unmixed effusions of joy, and displayed a social triumph and exultation, which no private prosperity, even the greatest, is ever able fully to inspire. Traditions remain of men, particularly of Oughtred, the mathematician, who died of pleasure when informed of this happy and surprising event. The king's declaration was well calculated to uphold the satisfaction inspired by the prospect of public settlement. It offered a generous amnesty to all persons whatsoever, and that without any exceptions but such as should afterwards be made by Parliament, which, upon mature deliberation, should be offered for ensuring that indulgence. It submitted to the arbitration of the same assembly the inquiry into all grants, purchases, and alienations, and it assured the soldiers of all their arrears, and promised them for the future the same pay which they then enjoyed. The lords, perceiving the spirit by which the kingdom as well as the commons was animated, hastened to reinstate themselves in their ancient authority, and to take their share in the settlement of the nation. They found the doors of their house open, and all were admitted, even such as had formerly been excluded on account of their pretended delinquency. The two houses attended, while the king was proclaimed, with great solemnity, in Palace Yard at Whitehall, and at Temple Bar. The commons voted £500 to buy a jewel for Granville, who had brought them the king's gracious messages. A present of £50,000 was conferred on the king, £10,000 on the Duke of York, £5,000 on the Duke of Gloucester. A committee of lords and commons was dispatched to invite his majesty to return and take possession of the government. The rapidity with which all these events were conducted was marvellous, and discovered the passionate zeal and entire unanimity of the nation. Such an impatience appeared, and such an emulation, in lords and commons and city, who should make the most lively expressions of their joy and duty, that, as the noble historian expresses it, a man could not but wonder where those people dwelt who had done all the mischief, and kept the king so many years from enjoying the comfort and support of such excellent subjects. The king himself said that it must surely have been his own fault that he had not sooner taken possession of the throne, since he found everybody so zealous in promoting his happy restoration. The respect of foreign powers soon followed the submission of the king's subjects. Spain invited him to return to the Low Countries and embark in some of her maritime towns. France made protestations of affection and regard, and offered Calais for the same purpose. The States General sent deputies with a like friendly invitation. The king resolved to accept of this last offer. The people of the republic bore him a cordial affection, and politics no longer restrained their magistrates from promoting and expressing that sentiment. As he passed from Breda to the Hague, he was attended by numerous crowds, and was received with the loudest acclamations, as if themselves, not their rivals in power and commerce, were now restored to peace and security. The States General in a body, and afterwards the States of Holland apart, performed their compliments with the greatest solemnity. Every person of distinction was ambitious of being introduced to his Majesty. All ambassadors and public ministers of kings, princes, or states repaired to him, and professed the joy of their masters in his behalf, so that one would have thought that from the united efforts of Christendom had been derived this revolution, which diffused everywhere such universal satisfaction. The English fleet came in sight of Scheveling. Montague had not waited for orders from the Parliament, but had persuaded the officers of themselves to tender their duty to his Majesty. The Duke of York immediately went on board, and took the command of the fleet as High Admiral. When the king disembarked at Dover, he was met by the general, whom he cordially embraced. Never subject in fact, probably in his intentions, had deserved better of his king and country. In the space of a few months, without effusion of blood, by his cautious and disinterested conduct alone, he had bestowed settlement on 3 kingdoms, which had long been torn with the most violent convulsions, and having obstinately refused the most inviting conditions offered him by the king, as well as by every party in the kingdom, he freely restored his injured master to the vacant throne. The king entered London on the 29th of May, which was also his birthday. The fond imaginations of men interpreted as a happy omen the concurrence of 2 such joyful periods. At this era it may be proper to stop a moment and take a general survey of the age, so far as regards manners, finances, arms, commerce, arts, and sciences. The chief use of history is, that it affords materials for disquisitions of this nature, and it seems the duty of an historian to point out the proper inferences and conclusions. No people could undergo a change more sudden and entire in their manners than did the English nation during this period. From tranquillity, concord, submission, sobriety, they passed in an instant to a state of faction, fanaticism, rebellion, and almost frenzy. The violence of the English parties exceeded anything which we can now imagine. Had they continued but a little longer, there was just reason to dread all the horrors of the ancient massacres and proscriptions. The military usurpers, whose authority was founded on palpable injustice, and was supported by no national party, would have been impelled by rage and despair into such sanguinary measures, and if these furious expedients had been employed on one side, revenge would naturally have pushed the other party, after a return of power, to retaliate upon their enemies. No social intercourse was maintained between the parties, no marriages or alliances contracted. The royalists, though oppressed, harassed, persecuted, disdained all affinity with their masters. The more they were reduced to subjection, the greater superiority did they affect above those usurpers, who, by violence and injustice, had acquired an ascendant over them. The manners of the 2 factions were as opposite of those of the most distant nations. Your friends, the Cavaliers, said a parliamentarian to a royalist, are very dissolute and debauched. True, replied the royalist, they have the infirmities of men, but your friends, the Roundheads, have the vices of devils, tyranny, rebellion, and spiritual pride. Riot and disorder, it is certain, notwithstanding the good examples set them by Charles I, prevailed very much among his partisans. Being commonly men of birth and fortune, to whom excesses are less pernicious than to the vulgar, they were too apt to indulge themselves in all pleasures, particularly those of the table. Opposition to the rigid preciseness of their antagonists increased their inclination to good fellowship, and the character of a man of pleasure was affected among them, as a sure pledge of attachment to the church and monarchy. Even when ruined by confiscations and sequestrations, they endeavored to maintain the appearance of a careless and social jollity. As much as hope is superior to fear, said a poor and merry cavalier, so much is our situation preferable to that of our enemies. We laugh while they tremble. The gloomy enthusiasm which prevailed among the parliamentary party is surely the most curious spectacle presented by any history, and the most instructive, as well as entertaining, to a philosophical mind. All recreations were in a manner suspended by the rigid severity of the Presbyterians and Independents. Horse races and cock matches were prohibited as the greatest enormities. Even bear-baiting was esteemed heathenish and unchristian. The sport of it, not the inhumanity, gave offence. Colonel Hewson, from his pious zeal, marched with his regiment into London, and destroyed all the bears which were kept there for the diversion of the citizens. This adventure seems to have given birth to the fiction of Hudibras. Though the English nation be naturally candid and sincere, hypocrisy prevailed among them beyond any example in ancient or modern times. The religious hypocrisy, it may be remarked, is of a peculiar nature, and being generally unknown to the person himself, though more dangerous, it implies less falsehood than any other species of insincerity. The Old Testament, preferably to the New, was the favourite of all the sectaries. The Eastern poetical style of that composition made it more easily susceptible of a turn which was agreeable to them. We have had occasion, in the course of this work, to speak of the many sects which prevailed in England. To enumerate them all would be impossible. The Quakers, however, are so considerable, at least so singular, as to merit some attention, and as they renounced by principle the use of arms, they never made such a figure in public transactions as to enter into any part of our narrative. The religion of the Quakers, like most others, began with the lowest vulgar, and in its progress came at last to comprehend people of better quality and fashion. George Fox, born at Drayton in Lancashire in 1624, was the founder of this sect. He was the son of a weaver, and was himself bound apprentice to a shoemaker. Feeling a stronger impulse towards spiritual contemplations than towards that mechanical profession, he left his master, and went about the country clothed in a leathern doublet, a dress which he long affected, as well for its singularity as its cheapness. That he might wean himself from sublunary objects, he broke off all connections with his friends and family, and never dwelt a moment in one place, lest habit should beget new connections, and depress the sublimity of his aerial meditations. He frequently wandered into the woods, and passed whole days in hollow trees, without company, or any other amusement than his Bible. Having reached that pitch of perfection as to need no other book, he soon advanced to another state of spiritual progress, and began to pay less regard even to that divine composition itself. His own breast, he imagined, was full of the same inspiration which had guided the prophets and apostles themselves, and by this inward light must every spiritual obscurity be cleared. By this living spirit must the dead letter be animated. When he had been sufficiently consecrated in his own imagination, he felt that the fumes of self-applause soon dissipate, if not continually supplied by the admiration of others, and he began to seek proselytes. Proselytes were easily gained, at a time when all men's affections were turned towards religion, and when the most extravagant modes of it were sure to be the most popular. All the forms of ceremony, invented by pride and ostentation, Fox and his disciples, from a superior pride and ostentation, carefully rejected. Even the ordinary rites of civility were shunned, as the nourishment of carnal vanity and self-conceit. They would bestow no titles of distinction. The name of friend was the only salutation with which they indiscriminately accosted every one. To no person would they make a bow, or move their hat, or give any signs of reverence. Instead of that affected adulation, introduced into modern tongues, of speaking to individuals as if they were a multitude, they returned to the simplicity of ancient languages, and thou and thee were the only expressions which, on any consideration, they could be brought to employ. Dress, too, a material circumstance, distinguished the members of this sect. Every superfluity and ornament was carefully retrenched. No plaits to their coat, no buttons to their sleeves, no lace, no ruffles, no embroidery. Even a button to the hat, though sometimes useful, yet not being always so, was universally rejected by them with horror and detestation. The violent enthusiasm of this sect, like all high passions, being too strong for the weak nerves to sustain, threw the preachers into convulsions, and shakings, and distortions in their limbs, and they thence received the appellation of Quakers. Amidst the great toleration which was then granted to all sects, and even encouragement given to all innovations, this sect alone suffered persecution. From the fervor of their zeal, the Quakers broke into churches, disturbed public worship, and harassed the minister and audience with railing and reproaches. When carried before a magistrate, they refused him all reverence, and treated him with the same familiarity as if he had been their equal. Sometimes they were thrown into madhouses, sometimes into prisons, sometimes whipped, sometimes pilloried. The patience and fortitude with which they suffered begat compassion, admiration, esteem. A supernatural spirit was believed to support them under those sufferings, which the ordinary state of humanity, freed from the illusions of passion, is unable to sustain. The Quakers crept into the army, but as they preached universal peace, they seduced the military zealots from their profession, and would soon, had they been suffered, have put an end, without any defeat or calamity, to the dominion of the saints. These attempts became a fresh ground of persecution, and a new reason for their progress among the people. Morals with this sect were carried, or affected to be carried, to the same degree of extravagance as religion. Give a Quaker a blow on one cheek, he held up the other. Ask his cloak, he gave you his coat also. The greatest interest could not engage him, in any court of judicature, to swear even to the truth. He never asked more for his wares than the precise sum which he was determined to accept. This last maxim is laudable, and continues still to be religiously observed by the sect. No fanatics ever carried further the hatred to ceremonies, forms, orders, rites, and positive institutions. Even baptism and the Lord's Supper, by all other sects believed to be interwoven with the very vitals of Christianity, were disdainfully rejected by them. The very Sabbath they profaned. The holiness of churches they derided, and they would give to these sacred edifices no other appellation than that of shops or steeple-houses. No priests were admitted in their sect. Every one had received from immediate illumination a character much superior to the sacerdotal. When they met for divine worship, each rose up in his place and delivered the extempore inspirations of the Holy Ghost. Women also were admitted to teach the brethren, and were considered as proper vehicles to convey the dictates of the Spirit. Sometimes a great many preachers were moved to speak at once, sometimes a total silence prevailed in their congregations. Some Quakers attempted to fast 40 days, in imitation of Christ, and one of them bravely perished in the experiment. A female Quaker came naked into the church where the Protector sat, being moved by the Spirit, as she said, to appeal as a sign to the people. A number of them fancied that the renovation of all things had commenced, and that clothes were to be rejected, together with other superfluities. The sufferings which followed the practice of this doctrine were a species of persecution not well calculated for promoting it. James Naylor was a Quaker, noted for blasphemy, or rather madness, in the time of the Protectorship. He fancied that he himself was transformed into Christ, and was become the real Saviour of the world, and in consequence of this frenzy, he endeavoured to imitate many actions of the Messiah related in the Evangelists. As he bore a resemblance to the common pictures of Christ, he allowed his beard to grow in a like form. He raised a person from the dead. He was ministered unto by women. He entered Bristol mounted on a horse, I suppose from the difficulty in that place of finding an ass. His disciples spread their garments before him, and cried, Hosanna to the highest! Holy, holy is the Lord God of Sabaoth. When carried before the magistrate, he would give no other answer to all questions than, Thou hast said it. What is remarkable, the Parliament thought that the matter deserved their attention. Near 10 days they spent in inquiries and debates about him. They condemned him to be pilloried, whipped, burned in the face, and to have his tongue bored through with a red-hot iron. All these severities he bore with the usual patience. So far his delusion supported him. But the sequel spoiled all. He was sent to Bridewell, confined to hard labour, fed on bread and water, and debarred from all his disciples, male and female. His illusions dissipated, and after some time he was contented to come out an ordinary man, and return to his usual occupations. End of section 63, chapter 62, part 4. Recording by Greg Golding, Georgetown, Ontario, Canada. Section 64 of Volume 1E of History of England from the Invasion of Julius Caesar to the Revolution of 1688. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Golding. History of England from the Invasion of Julius Caesar to the Revolution of 1688 by David Hume, Volume 1E, Section 64, Chapter 62, Part 5. The chief taxes in England during the time of the Commonwealth were the monthly assessments, the excise, and the customs. The assessments were levied on personal estates as well as on land, and commissioners were appointed in each county for rating the individuals. The highest assessment amounted to £120,000 a month in England. The lowest was £35,000. The assessments in Scotland were sometimes £10,000 a month, commonly 6,000; those on Ireland 9,000. At a medium, this tax might have afforded about £1 million a year. The excise, during the civil wars, was levied on bread, flesh meat, as well as beer, ale, strong waters, and many other commodities. After the king was subdued, bread and flesh meat were exempted from excise. The customs on exportation were lowered in 1656. In 1650, commissioners were appointed to levy both customs and excises. Cromwell, in 1657, returned to the old practice of farming. £1,100,000 were then offered, both for customs and excise, a greater sum than had ever been levied by the commissioners. The whole of the taxes during that period might at a medium amount to about 2 millions a year, a sum which, though moderate, much exceeded the revenue of any former king. Sequestrations, compositions, sale of crown and church lands, and of the lands of delinquents, yielded also considerable sums, but very difficult to be estimated. Church lands are said to have been sold for £1 million. None of these were ever valued at above 10 or 11 years' purchase. The estates of delinquents amounted to about £200,000 a year. Cromwell died more than 2 millions in debt, though the Parliament had left him in the Treasury above £500,000, and in stores the value of £700,000. The Committee of Danger, in April 1648, voted to raise the army to 40,000 men. The same year, the pay of the army was estimated at £80,000 a month. The establishment of the army in 1652 was in Scotland 15,000 foot, 2,580 horse, 560 dragoons. In England, 4,700 foot, 2,520 horse, garrisons 6,154. In all, 31,514, besides officers. The army in Scotland was afterwards considerably reduced. The army in Ireland was not much short of 20,000 men, so that upon the whole the Commonwealth maintained in 1652 a standing army of more than 50,000 men. Its pay amounted to a yearly sum of £1,047,715. Afterwards the Protector reduced the establishment to 30,000 men, as appears by the instrument of government and humble petition and advice. His frequent enterprises obliged him from time to augment them. Richard had on foot in England an army of 13,258 men, in Scotland 9,506, in Ireland about 10,000 men. The foot soldiers had commonly a shilling a day. The horse had 2 shillings and sixpence, so that many gentlemen and younger brothers of good family enlisted in the Protector's cavalry. No wonder that such men were averse from the re-establishment of civil government, by which, they well knew, they must be deprived of so gainful a profession. At the time of the Battle of Worcester, the Parliament had on foot about 80,000 men, partly militia, partly regular forces. The vigour of the Commonwealth and the great capacity of those members who had assumed the government never at any time appeared so conspicuous. The whole revenue of the public during the protectorship of Richard was estimated at £1,868,717, his annual expenses at £2,201,540. An additional revenue was demanded from Parliament. The commerce and industry of England increased extremely during the peaceable period of Charles' reign. The trade to the East Indies and to Guinea became considerable. The English possessed almost the sole trade with Spain. 20,000 cloths were annually sent to Turkey. Commerce met with interruption, no doubt, from the civil wars and convulsions which afterwards prevailed, though it soon recovered after the establishment of the Commonwealth. The war with the Dutch, by distressing the commerce of so formidable a rival, served to encourage trade in England. The Spanish war was to an equal degree pernicious. All the effects of the English merchants, to an immense value, were confiscated in Spain. The prevalence of democratical principles engaged the country gentlemen to bind their sons' apprentices to merchants, and commerce has ever since been more honourable in England than in any other European kingdom. The exclusive companies, which formerly confined trade, were never expressly abolished by any ordinance of Parliament during the Commonwealth. But as men paid no regard to the prerogative whence the charters of these companies were derived, the monopoly was gradually invaded, and commerce increased by the increase of liberty. Interest in 1650 was reduced to 6%. The customs in England before the civil wars are said to have amounted to £500,000 a year, a sum 10 times greater than during the best period in Queen Elizabeth's reign. But there is probably some exaggeration in this matter. The post house, in 1653, was farmed at £10,000 a year, which was deemed a considerable sum for the three kingdoms. Letters paid only about half the present postage. From 1619 to 1638, there had been coined £6,900,042. From 1638 to 1657, the coinage amounted to £7,733,521. Dr. Davenant has told us, from the registers of the Mint, that between 1558 and 1659 there had been coined £19,832,467 in gold and silver. The first mention of tea, coffee, and chocolate is about 1660. Asparagus, artichokes, cauliflower, and a variety of salads were about the same time introduced into England. The colony of New England increased by means of the Puritans, who fled thither in order to free themselves from the constraint which Laud and the Church party had imposed upon them, and before the commencement of the civil wars, it is supposed to have contained 25,000 souls. For a like reason, the Catholics, afterwards, who found themselves exposed to many hardships, and dreaded still worse treatment, went over to America in great numbers, and settled the colony of Maryland. Before the civil wars, learning and the fine arts were favored at court, and a good taste began to prevail in the nation. The king loved pictures, sometimes handled the pencil himself, and was a good judge of the art. The pieces of foreign masters were bought up at a vast price, and the value of pictures doubled in Europe by the emulation between Charles and Philip IV. Of Spain, who were touched with the same elegant passion. Van Dyck was caressed and enriched at court. Inigo Jones was master of the king's buildings, though afterwards persecuted by the Parliament on account of the part which he had in rebuilding St. Paul's, and for obeying some orders of council, by which he was directed to pull down houses, in order to make room for that edifice. Laws, who had not been surpassed by any musician before him, was much beloved by the king, who called him the father of music. Charles was a good judge of writing, and was thought by some more anxious with regard to purity of style than became a monarch. Notwithstanding his narrow revenue, and his freedom from all vanity, he lived in such magnificence that he possessed 24 palaces, all of them elegantly and completely furnished, insomuch that, when he removed from one to another, he was not obliged to transport any thing along with him. Cromwell, though himself a barbarian, was not insensible to literary merit. Usher, notwithstanding his being a bishop, received a pension from him. Marvell and Milton were in his service. Waller, who was his relation, was caressed by him. That poet always said that the Protector himself was not so wholly illiterate as was commonly imagined. He gave £100 a year to the divinity professor at Oxford, and an historian mentions this bounty as an instance of his love of literature. He intended to have erected a college at Durham for the benefit of the northern counties. Civil wars, especially when founded on principles of liberty, are not commonly unfavorable to the arts of elocution and composition; or rather, by presenting nobler and more interesting objects, they amply compensate that tranquillity of which they bereave the muses. The speeches of the parliamentary orators during this period are of a strain much superior to what any former age had produced in England, and the force and compass of our tongue were then first put to trial. It must, however, be confessed that the wretched fanaticism which so much infected the parliamentary party was no less destructive of taste and science than of all law and order. Gaiety and wit were proscribed, human learning was despised, freedom of inquiry detested, cant and hypocrisy alone encouraged. It was an article positively insisted on in the preliminaries to the Treaty of Uxbridge, that all playhouses should forever be abolished. Sir John Davenant, says Whitlock, speaking of the year 1658, published an opera, notwithstanding the nicety of the times. All the king's furniture was put to sale, his pictures, disposed of at very low prices, enriched all the collections in Europe. The cartoons, when complete, were only appraised at £300, though the whole collection of the king's curiosities was sold at above 50,000. Even the royal palaces were pulled in pieces, and the materials of them sold. The very library and medals at St. James's were intended by the generals to be brought to auction, in order to pay the arrears of some regiments of cavalry quartered near London. But Sidon, apprehensive of the loss, engaged his friend Whitlock, then Lord Keeper of the Commonwealth, to apply for the office of librarian. This expedient saved that valuable collection. It is, however, remarkable that the greatest genius by far that shone out in England during this period was deeply engaged with these fanatics, and even prostituted his pen in theological controversy, in factious disputes, and in justifying the most violent measures of the party. This was John Milton, whose poems are admirable, though liable to some objections; his prose writings disagreeable, though not altogether defective in genius. Nor are all his poems equal. His Paradise Lost, his Comus, and a few others, shine out amidst some flat and insipid compositions. Even in the Paradise Lost, his capital performance, there are very long passages, amounting to near a third of the work, almost wholly destitute of harmony and elegance, nay, of all vigour of imagination. This natural inequality in Milton's genius was much increased by the inequalities in his subject, of which some parts are of themselves the most lofty that can enter into human conception. Others would have required the most laboured elegance of composition to support them. It is certain that this author, when in a happy mood, and employed on a noble subject, is the most wonderfully sublime of any poet in any language, Homer and Lucretius and Tasso not excepted. More concise than Homer, more simple than Tasso, more nervous than Lucretius, had he lived in a later age and learned to polish some rudeness in his verses, had he enjoyed better fortune, and possessed leisure to watch the returns of genius in himself, he had attained the pinnacle of perfection, and borne away the palm of epic poetry. It is well known that Milton never enjoyed in his lifetime the reputation which he deserved. His Paradise Lost was long neglected. Prejudices against an apologist for the regicides, and against a work not wholly purged from the cant of former times, kept the ignorant world from perceiving the prodigious merit of that performance. Lord Somers, by encouraging a good edition of it, about 20 years after the author's death, first brought it into request, and Tonson, in his dedication of a smaller edition, speaks of it as a work just beginning to be known. Even during the prevalence of Milton's party, he seems never to have been much regarded, and Whitlock talks of one Milton, as he calls him, a blind man, who was employed in translating a treaty with Sweden into Latin. These forms of expression are amusing to posterity, who consider how obscure Whitlock himself, though Lord Keeper and Ambassador, and indeed a man of great abilities and merit, has become in comparison of Milton. It is not strange that Milton received no encouragement after the Restoration. It is more to be admired that he escaped with his life. Many of the cavaliers blamed extremely that lenity towards him, which was so honourable in the king, and so advantageous to posterity. It is said that he had saved Davenant's life during the Protectorship, and Davenant in return afforded him like protection after the Restoration, being sensible that men of letters ought always to regard their sympathy of taste as a more powerful band of union than any difference of party or opinion as a source of animosity. It was during a state of poverty, blindness, disgrace, danger, and old age, that Milton composed his wonderful poem, which not only surpassed all the performances of his contemporaries, but all the compositions which had flowed from his pen during the vigour of his age and the height of his prosperity. This circumstance is not the least remarkable of all those which attend that great genius. He died in 1674, aged 66. Waller was the first refiner of English poetry, at least of English rhyme, but his performances still abound with many faults, and what is more material, they contain but feeble and superficial beauties. Gaiety, wit, and ingenuity are their ruling character. They aspire not to the sublime, still less to the pathetic. They treat of love without making us feel any tenderness, and abound in panegyric without exciting admiration. The panegyric, however, on Cromwell contains more force than we should expect from the other compositions of this poet. Waller was born to an ample fortune, was early introduced to the court, and lived in the best company. He possessed talents for eloquence as well as poetry, and till his death, which happened at a good old age, he was the delight of the House of Commons. The errors of his life proceeded more from want of courage than honour or integrity. He died in 1687, aged 82. Cowley is an author extremely corrupted by the bad taste of his age. But had he lived even in the purest times of Greece nor Rome, he must always have been a very indifferent poet. He had no ear for harmony, and his verses are only known to be such by the rhyme which terminates them. In his rugged untenable numbers are conveyed sentiments the most strained and distorted, long-spun allegories, distant allusions, and forced conceits. Great ingenuity, however, and vigour of thought sometimes break out amidst those unnatural conceptions. A few Anacreontics surprise us by their ease and gaiety. His prose writings please by the honesty and goodness which they express, and even by their spleen and melancholy. This author was much more praised and admired during his lifetime, and celebrated after his death, than the great Milton. He died in 1667, aged 49. Sir John Denham, in his Cooper's Hill, for none of his other poems merit attention, has a loftiness and vigour which had not before him been attained by any English poet who wrote in rhyme. The mechanical difficulties of that measure retarded its improvement. Shakespeare, whose tragic scenes are sometimes so wonderfully forcible and expressive, is a very indifferent poet when he attempts to rhyme. Precision and neatness are chiefly wanting in Denham. He died in 1688, aged 73. No English author in that age was more celebrated, both abroad and at home, than Hobbes. In our time he is much neglected, a lively instance how precarious all reputations founded on reasoning and philosophy. A pleasant comedy, which paints the manners of the age and exposes a faithful picture of nature, is a durable work, and is transmitted to the latest posterity. But a system, whether physical or metaphysical, commonly owes its success to its novelty, and is no sooner canvassed with impartiality than its weakness is discovered. Hobbes's politics are fitted only to promote tyranny, and his ethics to encourage licentiousness. Though an enemy to religion, he partakes nothing of the spirit of scepticism, but is as positive and dogmatical as if human reason, and his reason in particular, could attain a thorough conviction in these subjects. Clearness and propriety of style are the chief excellencies of Hobbes' writings. In his own person he is represented to have been a man of virtue, a character nowise surprising, notwithstanding his libertine system of ethics. Timidity is the principal fault with which he is reproached. He lived to an extreme old age, yet could never reconcile himself to the thoughts of death. The boldness of his opinions and sentiments form a remarkable contrast to this part of his character. He died in 1679, aged 91. Harrington's Oceana was well adapted to that age, when the plans of imaginary republics were the daily subjects of debate and conversation, and even in our time it is justly admired as a work of genius and invention. The idea, however, of a perfect and immortal Commonwealth will always be found as chimerical as that of a perfect and immortal man. The style of this author wants ease and fluency, but the good matter which his work contains makes compensation. He died in 1677, aged 66. Harvey is entitled to the glory of having made, by reasoning alone, without any mixture of accident, a capital discovery in one of the most important branches of science. He had also the happiness of establishing at once his theory on the most solid and convincing proofs. And posterity has added little to the arguments suggested by his industry and ingenuity. His treatise of the circulation of the blood is further embellished by that warmth and spirit which so naturally accompany the genius of invention. This great man was much favoured by Charles I, who gave him the liberty of using all the deer in the royal forest for perfecting his discoveries in the generation of animals. It was remarked that no physician in Europe, who had reached 40 years of age, ever, to the end of his life, adopted Harvey's doctrine of the circulation of the blood, and that his practice in London diminished extremely from the reproach drawn upon him by that great and signal discovery. So slow is the progress of truth in every science, even when not opposed by factions or superstitious prejudices. He died in 1657, aged 79. This age affords great materials for history, but did not produce any accomplished historian. Clarendon, however, will always be esteemed an entertaining writer, even independent of our curiosity to know the facts which he relates. His style is prolix and redundant, and suffocates us by the length of its periods. But it discovers imagination and sentiment, and pleases us at the same time that we disapprove of it. He is more partial in appearance than in reality, for he seems perpetually anxious to apologize for the king, but his apologies are often well grounded. He is less partial in his relation of facts than in his account of characters. He was too honest a man to falsify the former. His affections were easily capable, unknown to himself, of disguising the latter. An air of probity and goodness runs through the whole work, as these qualities did in reality embellish the whole life of the author. He died in 1674, aged 66. These are the chief performances which engaged the attention of posterity. The numberless productions with which the press then abounded, the cant of the pulpit, the declamations of party, the subtleties of theology, all these have long ago sunk in silence and oblivion. Even a writer such as Selden, whose learning was his chief excellency, or Chillingworth, an acute disputant against the papists, will scarcely be ranked among the classics of our language or country. End of section 64, chapter 62, part 5. Recording by Greg Golding, Georgetown, Ontario, Canada.